Welcome, both Sallux and Jubilee Centre supporters. We're going to have a discussion of the importance of why Christians should look at the world through a relational lens and how they can do that. It'll take the format of a discussion with Dr. Michael Schluter, who founded the Jubilee Centre way back when in the 1980s and sort of pioneered the idea of approaching public policy and thinking about the Bible through a relational lens. We're going to pray first. Michael will just maybe give a couple of minutes introduction of sort of a little bit of the history of how he came to this approach, and then it'll be largely a Q&A process where I'll ask leading questions and Michael will respond, and then we'll have questions from the audience at the end. Preferably we'll do that through the chat, so if you have specific questions as they come up, it'll be good to put them in the chat, and we'll sort of mediate those through that process. But perhaps one or two may well want to ask questions in person, and you may be able to raise a hand to do that. So I'll just pray for us, and then over to Michael for a brief introduction of where did relational thinking come from. Heavenly Father, we proclaim you as a triune God, three persons in one. And so we pray now that as we then proclaim that you made men and women in your image as relational beings, that we can see our relationship to you and to others as fulfilling that role as being made in your image. And so we pray for wisdom for Michael and ourselves as we listen as to how best to live and think about the message of your word. And we pray that as we convey that to the world through our lives and churches and thinking about public policy, that you would be glorified. Amen.
Amen.
So that, Michael, over to you just briefly to give us a flavour of where this idea of relational thinking came from.
So back in the day, we're talking 1970s here, I was living in Nairobi, and a number of university students from the University of Nairobi asked me to do a series of talks on a Christian response to capitalism, Marxism, and socialism with a pastor in Nairobi called Roy Clements, who was there at the time. So after that series, the question came up, is there a Christian-based, biblically based alternative to capitalism and socialism and Marxism, of course? So Roy Clements, the pastor I mentioned, said to me, if there is such a system of ideas in the Bible, the place to find it would be Old Testament law, because that is where God reveals his will about how to organize a society to the Israelites, who, remember, most of them never made it to the promised land. They were basically a lot of unbelieving people at that time. How do you organize a society in that context? So he said, well, place to look is look at what God told Moses to do in terms of finding answers to that question. So I went away and spent 3 weeks on holiday. I used to have 3-week holidays in those days. That was the day. So I was in Kenya, so I went to Mombasa, spent 3 weeks, I remember, at the coast in Mombasa, between swimming and sunbathing, thinking about this question and reading Deuteronomy and the other books of the Pentateuch in detail, and looking at all the different laws that were there inscribed. And the big question at the end of that was, well, what's the big idea that holds these laws together? Capitalism is largely around capital. Socialism is around the role of society in organizing society rather than the role of the individual. You could think about stewardship and the environment as another big theme in biblical law. But what holds all the laws together? So I looked at words like family and justice and so on, but none of them seem to be comprehensive. And I finally got to an answer to that question. I remember it well. In 1981, I was reading through Matthew's Gospel and came to Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40, where Jesus is asked the question, which is the greatest commandment? Now, that's not quite the question I was asking, but then Jesus, in his reply, answers my question, because Jesus, you'll remember when he's asked which is the greatest commandment, what he says is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus goes on to answer my question, which was when he said, on these two laws hangs all the law and the prophets. So imagine a hanging basket, and it's suspended from the wall from two nails that are hammered into the wall. One would be love God, one would be love your neighbor as yourself. And all the other laws, Jesus is saying, depend on those two fundamental laws at their origin. So I thought, well, that's fantastic. But I couldn't imagine myself going back to my World Bank work in Tanzania at the time, which was on compulsory villagization of peasants, and saying to the guys, look, if you really want to know whether it's best to put peasants in villages or whether to let them live on their original land, the answer is love. And I thought, well, they'll just think I'm off the planet. I'm sort of 1960s flower power or something like that. But then I realized that love is a quality of relationship. And what Jesus effectively is saying is, if you want to apply God's thinking into these sorts of questions, the right issue to raise, the right way of thinking about it, is to think, how are relationships between individuals, between groups, organizations, ethnic groups, racial groups, how are relationships impacted by the decisions you're making? So that's where it kicked off from, Paul. That's where it began.
Okay, thank you. And how would you say this is, in a sense, a unique characteristic of Christian thinking relative to other worldviews or religious frameworks?
Well, I think Western societies are heavily based on the individual. Everything is around the individual. So we have individual insurance, individual taxation. I don't need to tell you these things, Paul, as you're an economist who worked in the Treasury before. But we have individual voting rights. Everything is around the individual. And this is asking one to think a bit differently. We don't then just analyze the impact of a policy that's made at Westminster on how it impacts each individual, or that's important. We think about, or should be thinking about, according to this biblical principle, how does this affect the way families are able to hold together? How does it affect their role in society? Because institutions need function. They need a role if they're going to cohere over the long term. How does it affect communities, local communities? How does it affect relationships between ethnic groups or racial groups? We need to be thinking of, on every piece of legislation, we need to ask the question, how is this going to affect relationships within all of the different communities, organizations of which we're a part?
Thanks. And then, as you talked about the Old Testament roots of this idea, how has your thinking then been brought to view concepts in the Old Testament law like covenant and righteousness?
Well, both of them are really fundamentally relational ideas, because God is a relational God. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is a concept of God that is both unitary, God is one, but also relational within itself. The Father and loves the Son, and the Spirit gives witness to both the Father and the Son and their relationship together. So everything within the Bible holds together in that way. And Jesus himself in his ministry is supremely conscious of relational issues. And if I may, I'll just illustrate that with one case study. You remember Jesus is asked in Mark 5, I think it is, to go and heal Jairus' daughter. And as he's heading off in that direction, a woman comes and touches the edge of his cloak and is healed, and he stops and he summons the woman to see him. And he says to this woman, you know, well, first of all, he stops and says, somebody touched me, and everybody kind of laughs. How can you ask? The disciples say, how can you possibly ask who touched me in the middle of this crowd where everybody is hemming you in? But he insists, no, somebody touched me. I felt power go out of me. And this woman eventually comes forward and admits that she touched the edge of his cloak because she'd had this hemorrhaging going on in her life for 10 or 12 years. And it was destroying her life. And she believed that if she could only touch the edge of Jesus' cloak, she would be healed. And Jesus says to her at the end, my daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So Jesus says to this woman, my daughter. He's describing her as his daughter. We don't know how old this woman was. She'd had the hemorrhaging for 12 years. Maybe she was a late teenager. Maybe she was early 20s. Jesus was early 30s. But the point is, in spiritual terms, he saw her as a daughter. And I think effectively, he was also talking at the same time to Jairus, because he was saying to Jairus, look, you want me to come and heal your daughter, but there is some daughter of mine right here who is reaching out to me for help. How can I not stop and help that woman before I move on, or my daughter, if you like, before I move on to heal your daughter? But he said, don't worry, I am coming. Let's go now to your house. And then he, if you remember, raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. So it's just a small illustration of how Jesus recognizes the primacy of these relationships that exist with his own family and wants to prioritize them in his ministry.
Yeah, we've talked about his interpretation of the law and summary as love God, love neighbor. Are there any other instances or priorities that Jesus has in the sort of relational priorities within interpreting the law?
Well, I'm always very struck by the story of the Good Samaritan, because you remember in the story of the Good Samaritan, there's this Jew who's on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he falls among thieves and gets, I think, stripped pretty much naked, and his donkey's stolen, and he's left by the side of the road as for dead. And then the priest goes by and the Levite goes by. Neither of them pay any attention to this guy. They just pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan comes and stops and binds up the wound and his wounds and puts him on his own donkey, and then takes him down to Jericho and then pays the innkeeper to look after him. And Jesus says at the end to the lawyer who asked him the question, who is my neighbor, says, well, who do you think is the neighbor to this man? Now, what Jesus is effectively saying is that the one who cared for the needy stranger is obeying the law to love your neighbor as yourself more effectively than those who are connected by ethnic or racial connections. So I think we have to think in a very broad way about who is our neighbor in the modern world. It may be people in Africa who are starving. It may be people in the Middle East who are caught in the middle of a war. It may be people caught in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But we obviously can't care for every individual in the world. That's just not practical. But God may lay on our heart to pay special attention to and show special care for people in any of those categories or any of those situations.
Yeah. So how, having sort of highlighted the importance of this relational idea of thinking, both in Old and New Testament, how does that, first of all, affect our thinking and how we run our lives as, first of all, individuals and families in our households?
Well, time is the currency of relationship, I'm fond of saying. You can't build any close relationship unless you spend time on it. So a really important priority for Christians is to think about how they spend their time and who they are building relationships with. Again, you remember Jesus, before he chooses the 12 disciples, goes up and spends the night in prayer on a mountain. And then he comes down and he chooses his 12, because those 12 disciples were going to have a disproportionate amount of his time and therefore have, in a sense, extra special close relationships with Jesus. They were going to be the ones who were primarily trained. And then out of the 12, it is 3 only that he takes up the Mount of Transfiguration and into the room where Jairus' daughter is healed, for example. So Jesus recognizes that time is a very critical issue in any of his disciples' lives. And the real issue for us to think about, I think, as Christians is, first of all, how much time are we really giving to our relationship with God himself, either through reading his word or in prayer? How much time do we actually carve out for that? Is it a hurried 5 minutes each day? And does that reflect how important we see the relationship with him? And equally, who else do we give time to? And if we're married, as you know, Paul, yourself, how much time we create for our wives, how much time we create for children, for other close relatives and so on, is really important if we are to live a relational lifestyle, as just one example.
And do you want to comment? You've talked about time. Do you want to talk about distance in that relational issue for individual lives?
It's interesting in the Old Testament that the Jubilee laws on land have a strong implication for how closely one lives with one, how closely we are located to our relatives, because the Jubilee laws on land made it likely that not only would you meet up every 50 years as an extended family to kind of reconnect with one another, but generally speaking, most Israelites would have lived in the Old Testament close to their relatives and in long-term rooted communities. Now, we're used to, in the West, the idea that comes from economists like you and me, Paul, that mobility of labor is good for the economy and we should encourage people to move as much as possible. But that doesn't take any account of the relationship implications of moving. And every time you move house, for example, your spouse, your children, and yourself have to create a whole new set of relationships in the community and maybe in the city where you're living. So I think one of the principles that I've strongly believed emerges from this understanding of the theme of relationships ties in closely with the Old Testament Jubilee and suggests that rootedness is an important principle in helping us build long-term relationships with people. Because when you've known people a long time, you remember their history, you know the things that happened in the past in their lives, you know the ups and downs that have happened to them, and you're able to develop relationships at a much deeper level than you can with a stranger.
Yeah, thanks. Moving on from individual households, families, how should churches think about their governance, their life together from this relational perspective? Perhaps also Christian organizations and charities.
Well, I think it is easy for churches to fall into a pattern of preaching the gospel of salvation in a rather individualistic way. And there's no doubt that each one of us as individuals in the end are called to respond to the call of Jesus to give our lives to him and become his disciples and follow him. But automatically and from day one, we're called to become members of a Christian community, a local church. And the idea that you can just be an individual Christian on your own and live it out by yourself is not really consistent with the way that the New Testament teaches what Christianity is about. It's all about being in a community. And Paul in Ephesians, for example, talks about the way that Christians in community, through what they say and do with one another, strengthen each other in their commitment to Christ and teach each other to follow Christ more closely. So the idea, well, I'm going to just be a Christian. I'm going to be at home. I'll do my thing, and I don't need to worry about other Christians, is very foreign to the New Testament way of thinking, and a rather unrelational way of thinking. It underestimates the way that iron sharpens iron. It underestimates how we care for one another, and that's what God wants us to do, to care for one another within the Christian community. So if somebody is sick, we should be visiting them. If they're in prison, we should be going to see them. I remember when I had COVID not so very long ago, and I was really sick. We have some Iranian Christians in our church, and they were amazing how they brought food for us day after day after day, just to help my wife cope, help me cope. And it touched me very, very deeply, the care they showed. And I remember 25 years ago, when we had a flood in our house, and we had, 2 feet of water all over the ground floor of the house, the Christians in my house group at that church got together and they brought us a new freezer, a new fridge, and all our other white goods, which had got knocked out by the flood. And they just renewed many of those white goods for us as just an act of generosity. And, it left me in tears at the time, I remember.
Hmm. Is there any sort of pointers for church leaders on sort of thinking about how to encourage relational thinking within their communities?
Well, depending on the size of the church, I think a really good pattern is to start a church service by asking people to talk to the people sitting next to them. If they don't know who they are, just to find out their names, encourage them to talk to each other and just to share something in their lives that has happened in the last week, to kind of, as it were, reconnect the members of the congregation with each other, and also to give them a proper chance to welcome any newcomers who happen to be sitting close to them. And we tend not to do that. We just go into a church and the church service starts with no kind of effort to get those in the church community to talk to each other or to talk to those who've come in from outside. So that would be one example in which one might change the way a church service operates.
And then moving out the concentric circle, how would you then think about public policy from a relational perspective, and perhaps how Christians can be salt and light in the public space to promote this idea?
I think there are 2 levels of answer to that, and I'm going to take one, and you can prod me if you want the other one. But if you take the public policy question, I think what Christians really want to see political parties require and the civil service doing is doing some kind of relational analysis of the impact of new legislation. Again, you know this much better than me after your years in the Treasury, Paul, but I think I'm right in saying that appended to every bill is an analysis of what the impact would be on the costs of government departments and local government as well, so that you can't pass a bill through Parliament without somebody calculating the implications financially. Now, we don't do anything similar in terms of legislation for the impact on relationships. I remember the Australians introduced what were called family impact assessments. So they were looking, I think, back in the 80s or 90s of the last century. It seems 30 or 40 years ago now. Anyway, quite a while back, they were looking at the impact of every bit of legislation in terms of its impact on both nuclear and extended families. And it seems to me that's a very helpful practice to try and bring some discipline into the processes of government to look at some of the relational consequences of what's being proposed. But that would just be one example.
So you're sort of suggesting a more formal role for a department or a minister for family affairs or relational infrastructure, sort of community sort of foundations to be explicitly there in the process of making decisions.
Yes, definitely. I think definitely it seems to me quite extraordinary that the family is recognized by sociologists as being, well, relationships are recognized, I should say, by sociologists as being the primary source of human well-being and human flourishing. Comes not out of how much money you've got, but the quality of your relationships. And yet the political process only looks generally at the economic implications of the policies that they're putting forward. They don't explicitly require an analysis of how it will impact on relationships within households, within extended families, within local communities. And in fact, many government decisions explicitly preclude the introduction of family or benefits to relatives, which are ruled out as involving on the basis of nepotism. So a local council has built a new block of flats, can't easily put relatives to live close together in a block of new flats because that would be regarded as improper. Everything must be done randomly. And if you've got a person from a particular ethnic group, racial group, family group, you must make sure that there's nobody else from that group in the block of flats, which is exactly the antithesis of, in a sense, what we're talking about. Now, I know the intention is to ensure fairness to every individual, but the fairness to every individual can run counter to trying to allow relatives to live close enough to each other to provide practical help. Now, if you go to Hong Kong, for example, if you invite your grandmother to live in your home with you, you get a special tax allowance. And in Singapore, if you relocate close to within, I think it's half a kilometer or a kilometer of your relatives, you get a tax allowance for that. So the systems recognize that locating relatives close to one another is, first of all, a legitimate object of public policy. But secondly, actually, it saves the public purse a lot of money. I mean, isn't it better that a close relative drops in on a person who's elderly and needs to take their pills every day to make sure they've taken the pills, rather than requiring a health visitor employed by the government at large expense to go round and check on that old person to make sure that the pills have been taken? I mean, it's a trivial example, but but life is full of, quotes, trivialities at that level. It's the kind of things that take a lot of cost from the treasury if families and neighbors don't do those things.
Any thoughts on how Christians can challenge this cultural emphasis on individualism, on sort of personal freedom, maximizing of personal choice or incomes? How do we go about sort of being salt and light in a relational way within society?
Well, it's some years since I was advancing some of these ideas, Paul, so I'm going back a little bit, and you will remember them because you were involved probably at the time. But I remember one suggestion we had was one could encourage members of an extended family to form themselves into what we call family associations. So if you could get, let's say, 20 relatives or even 50 relatives to agree to meet together once or twice a year, you could ask them if they would be willing to, for example, do their car insurance together, so you could get a group discount on your family fleet of cars if you all insured with the same company. And indeed, one of the big insurance companies started to offer that as a substantial, like 25% discount on your car insurance. You could persuade the big supermarkets that if a group of you all went to the same supermarket, Tesco, Sainsbury, Asda, whoever, then you'd get a family discount card that you could present at the checkout and get an automatic deduction of, I don't know, 2-3% or something on your groceries bill each week. Those kinds of things could be done to give the family unit or extended family unit a bit more clout and recognition. But there's a whole range of possibilities here. So if you had a family savings fund, which, for example, you could put money into up to £5,000 a year, let's say, and then you got some tax discount for doing that, then those family funds could be used to pay for health expenses or dental expenses and so on in the private sector, which would then reduce the pressure on the NHS. So there are those kinds of possibilities as well.
Yeah, so we've sort of got some ideas for how to think relationally within public policy. How should Christians go about trying to influence public policy? You've had a bit of experience with Keep Sunday Special and a few other campaigns. Any thoughts on how to try and make an impact in the wider political conversation about how do we raise this issue of the importance of relationships?
It's a tough question. I think there are a number of possible ways forward on this. One can go and talk to the MP and discuss with them the kinds of concerns we're talking about here, about how family, or rather how public policy is impacting on the strength of families, and try and ask MPs, your MP, to consider whether they could raise with the relevant government ministers or departments some of these ideas, to ask them to consider them and to support you in trying to make the case to get these things to happen. Obviously, in countries where you have a lot of Christians, you can try and form parties that are much more explicitly interested in what Christian teaching is, but that's much more difficult in Western Europe today than it would be, let's say, in East Africa or West Africa, where there are many more people who are acknowledging their Christian faith and are influenced in terms of wanting to see that Christian faith impact on policy. But whether it's in the Netherlands or Britain or any other country in Western Europe, really, the Christian vote is too small as a fraction of the total electorate to generally influence the way people think. One thing we did do in the Jubilee Centre years ago was we ran something called Christian Election Forum. So we asked a minister in each of the major towns in Britain to organize a public meeting where the churches would come together to ask MPs questions. So we got, in some constituencies, 300 or 400 people would turn out, and they would obviously at that time be asking about Sunday trading and what the MP's view was on Sunday trading. And I remember one public meeting that was held in the south of England, in Dover or somewhere like that. And this MP wrote to the Times and said, the Conservative Party, to which I belong, he said, is going to put a 3-line whip on me to vote in favor of Sunday trading. And So I was asked to a local meeting organized by a church to come and talk about the issue of Sunday trading and what the government's view was and so on, and how I was going to vote. So I went along quite confident with a government briefing to argue the case for Sunday trading because I thought it was very popular among people and so on. And I put the case for why the government wanted Sunday trading. And then it was opened up to questions. And then there was a number of questions were put up, most of which didn't seem to agree with me very much. And then it was put to the vote. And out of 400 people in the room, 396 voted against me and 4 abstained. And that was 400 people. There was not a single person there who wanted Sunday trading. Now, this MP then wrote to the Times and said, now, what am I meant to do? I'm meant to represent my constituents, but I also have to follow a 3-line whip from the party. And what should I do as an MP? What's the right thing for me to do? Can I really ignore the very strong message coming from my constituents that they don't want Sunday trading? They want Sunday traditionally looked after and maintained as it had been. So you can see that if Christians get together and hold some public meetings, it might be on abortion, it might be on euthanasia or a range of issues, and some of them perhaps not as clear-cut as those, not life issues, but economic issues too. And the churches hold the meetings and invite all the churches in the community to come, and there are a sufficient number there to persuade the MP that he does need to worry about what this group of people think. Then you may be, and obviously the local press are invited as well, and television, then you may find MPs are more susceptible to pressure than you imagine.
So yes, I think in the past you've done that with meetings around a campaign about an issue in legislation coming up, like Sunday trading. I think in the past, although we didn't manage to do it this year, there's been fora hosted by churches at election time to pose questions inspired by Christian application to public policy to candidates in a constituency to try and get their views on specific issues of interest to Christians. So those are sort of specific campaigning and election issues. But then you say, you need to have a relationship with your member of parliament and try and sort of influence them just by raising your concerns with them.
In their constituency surgeries, yes. I think we used to run those meetings, Paul, you may well remember this, under the name of Christian Election Forum. And I remember that we would maybe run, a couple of hundred of those meetings. I remember we used to run them on Valentine's Day back in the day when an election was coming up in April, May or something. But I remember that by running a whole set of those meetings, you could get national publicity around it.
Just if we move on to sort of specific areas, just to show how the relational lens applies. If we say education, how do you think that sort of relational thinking would change how schools are run, what is taught, and so on, just to give a flavor of the relational lens in practice?
Yes, we did have at one time a big relational schools project, and the person running it moved to Australia. And they then had a massive relational schools project in Australia as a consequence of him moving over there, but we kind of lost him over here. But I think there's a lot of issues around education and schooling. So if you take the curriculum question first, it's strange that we don't teach in schools how people might consider relating more effectively to people of different religion or ethnic origin or racial background. We don't teach those skills in any deliberate sense. Now, I know that today, in a way that was not true 40 years ago when I set out, that issues between men and women has become highly contentious, and how you identify who is a man and who is a woman, and whether people self-identify or whether they identify themselves on the basis of their biology, or what it may be based on. But there is still an enormous potential, I think, to teach what we call in our writings relational literacy, just helping people think about where the other person is coming from, how they can gradually build a relationship with somebody who may have a totally different religious or ethnic, racial origin, and just teaching those basic relational skills as part of the education system. At the moment, the education system is very orientated towards particular subject matter, maths, English, French, whatever, rather than teaching these essential life skills, whether that's in primary school or in secondary school. So I think there's a lot of potential in that space to teach relational literacy.
And just to throw you another area that you're currently interested in applying relational thinking would be in foreign affairs and peace building between conflicting communities and nations. You just want to, maybe this is the last question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, how this relational lens applies to perhaps the most intractable conflicts around the world, the disagreements between communities and countries.
Well, maybe a couple of quick comments. One is, I think there is great potential in trade agreements where countries have had a period of conflict and one is trying to rebuild some trust. So after the Second World War, France and Germany formed a trade agreement for the trading of coal and iron ore and steel, because a lot of the conflict between France and Germany in the Second World War was around the Ruhr Valley and its enormous resources of coal and iron, which produced the steel, which produced the armaments. So the trade agreement between France and Germany, which brought in also the Benelux countries as well, Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, and Liechtenstein, I think, all those 6 countries formed the coal and steel community after the war, and that morphed into the European Economic Community as it extended to more and more products, and then eventually into the EU that we have today, where trade can take place among all of these, I think now 12 countries in the EU. I can't remember the total number who can trade. Sorry, 23?
20, well, after Brexit, I think it's 27.
Yes, okay, 27, but without any border controls and import duties. So this started in a small way, and it's just grown and grown to be a very substantial trading bloc now. And we've suggested between North and South Korea, if they could only start with a trade agreement to maybe start trading just agricultural products initially, but extending it out from there, this would start to build a relationship between North and South Korea, which could have enormous implications for long-term peace. So I think there are a number of initiatives of that kind to bring about what we call mutual convergent development. You're trying to bring, on a mutual basis, convergent development between 2 countries or regions or ethnic groups.
And before we go to questions from the floor, is there any last point you'd like to make about the importance of the relational lens and how we think about that?
I think for me, one of the main attractions of it, of this relational approach, has enabled me to think about every aspect of life through the eyes of the Lord, because I'm sure that God thinks in relational terms rather than, let's say, in financial terms. Now, finance and economics is an aspect of relationships, an important aspect of relationships, but relationships are bigger than economics and finance. It's a much broader category of thinking. And there are just so many different areas. I produced this book years ago called The R Option with someone called David Lee. And these were the titles of the chapters: time, communications, management, money, lunch, leisure, friends, soulmates, sex, loss, forgiveness, roots, health, schooling, cities, security, strangers, everything. So, but the point was that that you can look at almost every aspect of life through a relational lens. It's a matter of learning to do that and applying that principle. But I think one thing that was particularly came through to me from that book was the importance of forgiveness. And often we pray in the Lord's Prayer every day, probably forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And I remember for years and years, I used to tick a little box in my mind. Oh, there's nobody I haven't forgiven. So that's fine. I tick the box, on I go, as if I don't know why Jesus bothered to mention it, really, kind of thing. And then one day, I was sitting with my wife discussing who we would invite to a party among our relatives. And we went down the list and I said, yeah, my brother, yes. And then we came to one particular relative and I don't think I want them. And my wife, Oriel, looked at me and she said, well, what's this about, Mike? Tell me, what's going on here? And as she probed, and she's a counselor, so she does this probing rather well, what I realized was that my sister had said something to me 10 years before about one of my sons, and I'd never forgiven her for what she'd said about it. Now, you might think that's quite extreme, but I think often where forgiveness is most challenging is with some of our closest friends and relatives. If they say something that that really hurts us, we find it incredibly difficult to forgive and move on. So I just encourage anyone listening to this to think about relationships in the close family and think about whether, if you had a party this weekend, whether there's anybody you wouldn't want to invite among your relatives, because I found that really challenging myself, to my shame.
Thanks. So we're going to go to questions in the Q&A in the chat. So just a reminder that if you'd like to put a question to Michael, if you could do so, and I'll read them out. I think Ruben, who we know well, has asked, how can we cultivate trust in relation to the government and other local institutions? I think it's fair to say trust in government and other institutions, particularly media and other claimed authorities, seem to be at close to all-time lows in opinion polls and surveys. How do we sort of reestablish trust?
I think at a national level, that's really difficult. One can, of course, seek to get greater public accountability for the behavior of politicians or the police department or other public bodies. But I think probably my instinct is to feel that time is best spent trying to meet people face to face, where one is wanting to build that relationship or deal with something which one feels has been unfair. So most MPs have a surgery once a week or several times a month where you can go and talk to the MP. You have to ring the office, get an appointment, and so on, like you would with a doctor. That seems to be how it works. But I think just going and talking face to face with the MP and raising a concern and making your argument and listening carefully to what they say, and maybe doing that, even several times a year or several times over the life of a parliament, so you build a relationship with the MP, they know who you are. As long as you do it graciously and you listen carefully, can be really helpful in building a relationship with one's MP. And then they will listen to your concerns, and it may really change their voting behavior. I think public meetings by a local church, inviting the MP to come and speak. I remember, again, in the past, MPs saying to me, the local church ran this meeting for me, and I was amazed to find 200 or 300 people there from the different churches. But the way that they spoke to me, that they listened carefully, they treated me with respect, and I really sensed that they had a genuine concern that then really influenced my voting behavior after that. And I remember somebody who was in the cabinet until recently saying exactly that to me. And also that particular MP had then wanted, it was during the expenses scandal some years back now, when the MPs were being accused of claiming their expenses unfairly. And this MP wanted to explain to his constituents about what had happened with his expenses, because he felt he was a bit vulnerable, I think. So he asked a local vicar whether he would use his Anglican church, which was a large building, and invite all the churches to send people who had questions on this issue that they would like to address to him as the local MP, please to come to this public meeting and to ask their questions so he could try and answer them. And I think 300 people turned out to this meeting. He was absolutely amazed at the number. And they asked a lot of questions and he answered them. But he said to me afterwards, it was a most satisfying experience for me. I had a chance to say what had happened, explain my position, explain why I'd claimed these expenses and not those expenses, to examine my own behavior and to listen to their concerns. And I just felt that ability to put this matter to bed, to just to build the relationship with the constituents was incredibly important to me. And I'm sure it affected how he voted subsequently on all kinds of issues.
Thank you. Moving on, Annette puts a question about, she's following up on the idea that there are statistics about how healthy relationships improve our welfare, sense of well-being, longevity, and other things in their regards. And she asks, is there any chance that sort of economic statistics can be adapted to bring in some of the relational benefits of improved family life? Whatever her example was, if we move to a 4-day week that would allow presumably more family time together for children and parents, how would those benefits be built into an economic measure that might be used to justify that policy?
I feel almost that you would be better to answer this than I would, Paul, actually.
Yes. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's a tricky one in the sense that blending statistics is difficult, in that, if you're looking at GDP or incomes or whatever, it has a purpose, it has a meaning. Not sure the data underpinning this is particularly well established, but that it has a purpose. Whereas I think you could start building a suite of relational statistics that measured the well-being of wider society, and hold a government to account for those, although of course it would take a sort of longer time scale. So the things I would perhaps include in a sort of relational health index for society would be things around how many children live with both their natural parents, what's the level of divorce, what's the prison population relative to the wider population, what's the suicide rate, how many old people see no one regularly during the week, do people know their neighbours, those sorts of relational statistics that you could collect, which are collected but are just not emphasised or given a particular sort of policy focus, that would help. So I perhaps suggest going down the sort of relational statistics approach and give weight to those things in public policy as a result.
Yes, Yes. I was just reaching for a book that we wrote, Paul, some years ago called After Capitalism, Rethinking Economic Relationships. It's a series of essays. And we wrote a couple in there called What Charter for Humanity, Defining the Destination of Development, and How to Create a Relational Society, Foundations for a New Social Order. Those were just two out of the, I think, 14 essays that were in that book we wrote, After Capitalism. I'm going to put it up there so you can see it. And I know that we have copies of that available. So if anyone's interested in that book, if they get in touch with the Jubilee Centre office or Ruben Alarcon, who runs that, he can certainly make sure you get hold of a copy of that.
Moving on to another question that's perhaps more for your wife, Michael, than ourselves. It's Howard asks, safeguarding is a very strong emphasis, particularly in how charities and churches are run. We have to have safeguarding policies and statements to conform with charity law and so on. And yet this concern about safeguarding seems to militate against sort of close, trusting relationships. Although it doesn't specify, how do we sort of balance or bring about a reconciliation between this idea of needing to protect from abuse versus the idea of close interpersonal relationships being encouraged?
Yes, it is a really difficult question, I think. Thinking of my own church community, I go to a small FIEC, Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches. I go to a small church in South Cambridge called Christ Church Trumpington, and we would not put people in charge of children in the Sunday school section of the church, or the children's classes, however you want, whatever the label you want to give it, or with teenagers, without going through a very careful safeguarding exercise. And we have a safeguarding officer in the church, because I think we feel we have to both make absolutely sure we're squeaky clean internally, and also because we need to satisfy any parents coming to the church that we have taken all possible due diligence. And by God's grace, we haven't had any issues in the time that I've been in the church, which was when it started as a spin-off from another church 10 years ago. And even in the church from which we were spun off, there in the 10 years I was there, or 12 years I was there were no cases either. But all of those safeguarding issues were in place. And I think that is a very important thing to do. Something that churches should be doing. But again, it comes down to a lot of common sense kinds of measures that that those who are asked to teach children at a vulnerable age are checked out very carefully in terms of references that from people who've known them for a long time, which are checked by telephone calls, not just by an email or something, but on the phone, things like that. Just routine good practice in terms of allowing people to teach and have contact with children, and also asking parents to just pay careful attention to what their children are saying about what happens in the classes at churches and things like that. So, I mean, these are very simple, common sense things I'm saying, really, but I'm saying they are important in a society where we really don't know our neighbors terribly well. In fact, because we don't see them every day. We only maybe see them on a Sunday, and we may not have been in the church for very many years because we've just moved to an area. We just don't know the people who are teaching our children or in contact with them. And therefore, we have to really take a great deal of care that they're not getting abused. And the same would be true of Christian house parties or camps or, sports ventures over the summer. We don't know often when we send our children to these events. We don't know all the people involved, and it's just our responsibility as parents to just be very careful in who we are allowing to have that level of access to our children. But on the other hand, it has to be some level of trust somewhere.
Yeah. I think just from personal reflection, I think there's an element of relational wisdom that's needed. And so relational thinking isn't just taking people's word, trusting and forgiving easily or whatever. Part of relational thinking is about the need for reputation, honesty to be built, and so on. So it's interesting how in the New Testament the idea of letters being affirmed, that if you're joining a new congregation, you need to have sort of affirmation from the previous elders or whatever to join a new congregation. It's even sort of important that eldership in a church is always in the plural. So there's never one elder presbyter mentioned in the New Testament. It's always in the plural. So you've always got a check on leadership. It's never, this person's an appointed leader, they must be trustworthy. There's always checks and balances within that process to the realism of living in a simple world, that even those who claim to be Christians can be tempted, can fall, and therefore need checks and balances to guard their behavior.
Yes, it's also interesting, isn't it, when Paul is taking money to Jerusalem, he's always got 3 or 4 people with him, and I'm not sure if they're a sort of bodyguard or whether they're actually just provided public accountability that this money is being properly looked after. Yeah.
Peter has a sort of question or comment that he's been influenced by your thinking on relational approaches for some time, and has sort of applied those in peace building with Concordis. He'd like to hear any more stories you'd like to share about that relational approach to peace building. Perhaps you could talk about experience in South Africa or perhaps Sudan.
I think I know who the Peter is, and if it is Peter Marsden, which it may not be.
Yes, it is.
Peter, lovely to have you on this call, and I hope we'll have a personal call very soon. And I admire so much the work you've done through Concordis since that spun off in 2005 from what I was doing at the time. But it's amazing what you've achieved in Mali and other countries, and congratulations on all that hard work you've done. I think the relational approach has emphasized getting the two sides to a conflict or two perspectives on a situation just to meet physically face to face. And I remember my brother-in-law was in the House of Lords back in the 1980s, and my sister was a very effective hostess at their large country house in Sussex. And we invited a group of South Africans, before the end of apartheid. We invited them to come down to Lord Brentford's home, where they were entertained for several days. And you had, round the table, you had people from the South African government, you had people from the Broederbond, which was the extreme right-wing white Afrikaner organization, and then you had people from the ANC and the PAC and the other white, the other black groups who were trying to end apartheid. And they would sit round the same dinner table with some caution, and we were quite careful about trying to placed them around the table in a way that didn't seem to give preeminence to either the black community or the white community and so on, and trying to get them to have a chance just to talk to each other. And then we would ask them at the end of the meal or towards the end of the meal to go around the table just telling their personal stories. So what has happened in your life before you came to this meeting here? And often that would be, some of them chose to be very short, some of them would be much longer. But what was fascinating to me was that the white people in the room had no idea at that time of the challenges and problems that the black community were facing to get to school, to get to university, to hold a job down or anything, just getting to work in the morning on time. If you're coming out of Soweto and going into the main part of Johannesburg for a job, you've got to get a taxi or you've got to get a bus, and often they break down because they're not well maintained, and all the other multitude of problems that an ordinary low-income black person would face to get into work. So just getting people to meet and talk in an informal setting where there are no high stakes, there's no media involved, you're just meeting behind the scenes for a discussion, can be enormously powerful in terms of breaking down prejudices. And when it's very much easier to hate somebody from a different racial or ethnic group if you've never actually talked to them face to face and met them, never had an encounter. And so I think the role of these personal meetings in terms of achieving peace settlements is huge. And just one little story, I remember there had been war between North and South Sudan for a long time. And back in, I don't know, I'm guessing 2002, but I can't be sure of the exact date. But we held a conference for people from North and South Sudan to come and discuss a possible peace settlement. And the Naivasha talks had been going on formally, and they were deadlocked, and under a thing called the IGAD process. And at this IGAD conference, two people who'd been at one of our conferences and who'd met each other and talked to each other and had kept in touch afterwards, met up in the middle of the night and said, look, we're deadlocked again in this conference about getting peace between North and South Korea. Let's us discuss. Sorry, Sudan. Yes, Sudan. Thank you. Let us discuss what would be satisfactory to both of us. So they spent the night discussing that and came up with a formula, which they then presented to the conference the next day. And the conference all then accepted their ideas, and that kicked off about a 10-year period of peace between North and South Sudan. But it was because they had met informally first and got to trust each other enough to then spend the night talking together about what kind of peace settlement would be acceptable to both of them. So that's just one example of how relationship can be the key to peace building.
Thanks. Final question on the board from Vincent, talking about trade and the need for covenants and laws to be sort of observed within business and presumably trade agreements between nations. How do we go about trying to train and develop business leaders with this emphasis on the need for promise keeping, for fair dealing? Often these are very ambitious people who've risen to the top of their organization. How do we then relationally train them to think about promise keeping, trust, the importance of keeping one's word, and so on? How do we give business leaders relational skills?
Well, you'll remember, Paul, that another book I ended up publishing with the help of two other people who then refused to have their names on the front cover. So I was left with the only name on the front cover, but it was called "Is Corporate Capitalism the Best We've Got to Offer?" And it was a discussion of how you build stakeholder relationships in companies, because companies are in effect a network of relationships between shareholders, employees, obviously directors in particular, customers and suppliers, and so on. And thinking of companies in that way is crucial, I think, to the long-term success and stability of companies. So this was the definition that we came up with for the purpose of a company. It was this: the purpose of a company is to serve society, by maximizing long-term value creation in the interests of its employees, shareholders, customers, and suppliers, while ensuring the sustainability of the business and honoring its wider responsibilities to local communities and the environment. So if the person who asked the question would like to drop a note to Ruben Alicon at the Jubilee Centre and give them his address, I can either make sure that this booklet on "Is Corporate Capitalism the Best We Have to Offer?" I could ensure that the summary of this book is sent to them free of charge, of course, so that they can have a chance to read our thoughts on that issue. And of course, the book's available on Amazon as well, and so on.
Yeah. Picking up on that theme, I think we can say, yes, if you're interested in these issues and the application of them, there's plenty of material on the various websites of Sallux. So Michael and others have written books on the future of Europe from a relational perspective that can be ordered through there. Obviously, the Jubilee Centre, there's a lot of past material on applying the relational concept and where that comes from biblically. Also, we have a sister organization called the Relationship Foundation that seeks to apply these ideas to public policy areas, from prisons to hospitals to education and so on. So there's also something called the Marriage Foundation that specializes in research on the benefits of marriage and how it can be promoted within public policy. Probably left off others, but there's plenty of other sort of organizations thinking in this area and in this way, most of which have been spawned by Michael in one way or another in the past.
Can you just add the other website, which is the-relationist.net?
Yes.
The-relationist.net. A lot of stuff's on there too.
Yes. And I should also mention, as I'm chair, relational peace building initiatives as well.
Yes.
So many of the sort of relational applications can be found on those websites and downloading some of those materials. Well, we've come to the end of the questions that people have sent in. I'll just say, is there a last call for any other contribution? Perhaps somebody could either raise a hand or you could ask it live in person if you wanted to. But if not, I'll just wait a moment if anyone wants to do that. Yep, I don't think so. So we'll just thank Michael very much for giving us a flavor of his applications of relational thinking to public policy and where it derives from in the Bible. And we can continue to pray that these ideas percolate through sort of our societies so that we bring about relational healing in many of its dimensions, be that how families are being broken up, or issues around migration and the tensions that come from that, or what we teach in school. that's all. I'll thank Michael, and we'll finish the call now. Thank you for being on, and continue to support the work of Sallux and the Jubilee Centre.
Thank you. Thank you.